Good morning. I'm going to continue my series on the 2024 Olympiad in Budapest. It's the last round, and in Slovenia are against India. Gukesh is playing the former Russian Vladimir Fedoseev, a really good grandmaster. And let's see what happens. D4, knight f6, bishop to f4. This could either be a London system with an early f4, or it could be a Jabava London system where he's intending to play knight to c3 instead of c3. We'll see. d5. This accelerated London system is called at a minute when the bishop comes out first. e3 and f5, c5, combating the pawn on e5. First opportunity. The knight comes out and the knight comes to c6. And the knight comes to d2, so it's a London system. He will now be intending to play c3, bishop to d3, and queen either to c2 or e2, depending on his preference. I think c2 is marginally better, if I remember rightly. Bishop comes out, and the pawn comes. So he's getting his ideal London setup, and black is letting him. The queen comes out here. Maybe that's a bit. He's pinning the knight. He might well be thinking about playing the bishop here, and then he's got a threat to take the knight. And when the pawn takes, take with the queen and get a fork on the queen and on the king and rook. I'd say he puts a stop to that with knight to f6. It's great. Knight to d7. Bishop comes out, and the queen comes to c8, so he's got another defender. He's willing to swap off all these pieces here. And the rook comes to e1, c1. The pawn comes to a6. He's willing to swap off still. And a lot of material disappears on c6. And the pawn comes to c4. Plays to f6. He wants to be able to play e5 if this pawn gets taken. He wants to have e5 in compensation. Very slightly weakened pawn puts a bit more pressure on the c5 pawn. He now wants two attacking it, potentially three with that rook. There are two defending it at the minute. Comes to a5, threatening to chase the knight away. The bishop is chased and he comes to f5. He could have come here and then sighted in on here and then, but I think f5 is a really good square for the bishop. The king comes to e2. He realizes he doesn't need to castle and put his king out of the way, that they are fairly rapidly approaching an endgame, and his king belongs in the middle. The knight is chased back, and space is gained on the king side with the h5 pawn. The bishop retreats, and the bishop comes to e7. The rook comes to c3, and the king comes to f7. Again, no need to castle. Nice cozy home for the white king on black king on f7. The rooks double up and puts another rook on the c file. Pawn swapped and e5 is played. As I said, that was the compensation he's looking for. It doesn't just compensate him by being a pawn in the centre, it compensates him by giving him the opportunity to play either rook to b8 and begins to try to affect the pawn on b2. Couldn't play that before, of course, because the bishop on g3 covers the b8 square. So the pawn is taken and the pawn is taken back, and now white has a free pawn, just a pass pawn, just 3 squares from queening, and it gets one space near. It's 2 away from queening. Is this dangerous? Well, yeah, if you're not careful. But he seems to take a piece away from the defence, but even when the rook moves, the square f8, c8 is still defended by the rook, knight, and bishop. So, He probably doesn't need more. Attacks the pawn on b2. Defends the pawn on b2. Attacks the rook. And opens up the e-file against the king. Excellent. Bishop comes to c2. The rook comes to e8 so that he's at the least threatening to take this pawn with a discovered check. Knight comes to f3 and the rook comes to b3. So he's threatening twice this knight. And the knight comes to e1. Bishop comes to b4. Check with the rook, of course. And king comes to f1. He takes with the bishop and the knight takes back. He takes the rook, so he's gained a exchange. But the pawn is 2 away from queening, and now we'll have the rook and the bishop covering on. The knight takes, so that he's threatening this pawn. The knight comes here so that he can come here probably and back up his pawn some more. Rook takes the pawn on b2. The pawn is 1 away from queening. But the knight steps in to make sure that doesn't happen. The rook comes to attack the pawn on a3. And he can't do anything about it. So it gets taken. And yeah, he's created a little pawn chain, but it's not going to do him any good against these two passed pawns, the black has. And the rook doesn't need to cover anymore. The knight is doing it, and it's hard for him to threaten the knight. But 2 places he could threaten the knight were here and here. And now he's covering them both very well. So the knight attacks the rook, and the rook comes to b2 and threatens the knight. Alright, it's defended by the bishop, so he's probably not going to take that. But the threat is there, it keeps a restraint on the bishop. The rook comes to c3 to attack the pawn on e6. Rook comes to a6 to support this pawn. Rook tries to stop it, and the rook comes to c2. Now he's threatening to play rook here, check, and force the king off the back rank. The knight comes here, partly so that he can think about coming here, and partly so that the bishop is covering the d2 square. King comes to g6, so that it isn't check if he decides he's going to play the knight here. King comes to g2, and the knight comes to e7. It doesn't need to be on e8. It's still at c8. It still covers c8 from there. King comes a step closer to the pawn. Knight comes to d5, and now he's threatening the pawn, and the rook is still the pawn on c7, and the rook is still covering the pawn. Yeah, so now he's not covering the pawn anymore, and he's in danger of queening, so he takes it right away. Now he could just immediately win back his piece by playing rook to c6, and then he gets his piece back. But instead he plays d2, threatening to get a queen, and the king comes 1 step closer, and he checks the king. And a brilliant final move by Gukesh, rook to b2, so that the king doesn't threaten this rook anymore, so that he's threatening to play rook here, checkmate. Yeah, and if he plays knight here, then he can say check, then yeah, sorry, a bit sleepy here. Yeah, knight to e2 is definitely the best move for white. Yeah, he can just play rook to c6, threaten the rook, threaten the bishop. Maybe. No. Okay, I'm going to break my rules and have a quick look at the analysis. Says knight c2, rook to b1 check. Yeah, I was right. And then when he takes, he plays check here, and then he picks up the knight, and he's playing with 2 rooks against the rook and bishop. Doesn't matter that he gets this pawn. So it isn't about preserving the pawns. It's about preserving another material advantage, which is the exchange, which will be enough to win when there's 2 rooks on the board, yeah? So, that was the end of Gukesh's fantastic performance in the Budapest Olympiad, where he drew with Abdusattarov and one other, and he won the other 6 or 7 games. Absolutely fantastic performance, really high quality, and not just that it was such a high quality performance against such good players. Some of the games were just fantastic. He's a grinding win against Wei Yi, against China. His a fantastic end game against Caruana. Just some beautiful, beautiful chess played by Gukesh, which certainly made him a favourite to win the World Championship against Ding in a few weeks after this tournament was finished. Yeah, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.